Thank you again, Peter. So in 1937, Julian Huxley was approached by a very businesslike stranger who wrote this. Dear Sir, would you consent to being the father of my wife's child? Possibly by artificial insemination. I'm writing this as a feeler and purely from the eugenic point of view. Well, such an inquiry, needless to say, was boldly personal, but I like to think, there's no way of knowing, I suspect that it would hardly have startled Julian Huxley. As someone interested in the physiology of reproduction and in improvement, Julian Huxley might well have agreed to this request, we don't know. Equally, as someone expert in genetics and inheritance, he might have declined, only too cognizant of the depressive illness that ran in his family. The Huxleys, as a family, suffered very terribly from mental ill health. There was an unmistakable family history of very marked melancholy. T.H. Huxley's own father ended his days in an asylum. His doctor brother, T.H.'s brother, James, had pursued a career as superintendent of a lunatic asylum in Kent, but by 55 was himself troubled, as near mad as a Sandmain can be, T.H.'s wife wrote. T.H. Huxley recounted his own intermittent suffering. It was very significant. It's very clearly presented in his diaries and journals and letters, especially on his South Sea journey. The next generation suffered too. His daughter Marion was treated by the famous neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot in 1882. And his grandchildren weren't spared. Julian and Aldous' other brother committed suicide in 1914. And Julian himself suffered as much, perhaps more, we can't know, than his grandfather from what was by then called depression. And he spent really significant periods of time in institutions, sometimes experiencing years of paralysed inactivity. It really is extraordinary that despite and around this inherited state, T.H. Huxley and Julian Huxley, not to mention other members of the great family, but them in particular were so prolific, served in such high office, and drove their ideas with such success and very effective purpose. Well, the Huxleys were a family deeply afflicted by mental illness, and they were a very clever family. Their collective depressions were only matched, I think, by the family collective capacity to think about it, to be intrigued by the mysterious relationship between mind and body, body and mind. And indeed, their intellectual interest in minds and consciousness ran well beyond the incapacity that struck the grandfather, the grandson, and others in the family. And so in this lecture, my final lecture, and you'll recall that I've organised, structured these lectures a little experimentally by scale, from cosmos to interior selves. In this lecture, I explore their inquiries into many states of mind and states of being. And given his particular purchase on mind and perception, in this lecture, I'll incorporate Julian's brother, Aldous. The Huxley family, all of them, were deeply interested in different kinds of consciousness and unconsciousness, actually. Perception and afterlives, psychology, psycho-pharmacology, and even parapsychology. These were all intergenerational Huxley concerns that offer a way of tracking the comprehension of human minds between culture and nature, and over time between evolutionary psychology, psychoanalysis, and biological psychiatry. They were there at each stage. Well, T.H. Huxley did not really identify or care to identify with his familial forebears. Rather, he tended to distance himself from them, even we might say cut himself off from members of his, especially his father's family. I was in Imperial College, I'm sure I can say this, I was in Imperial College archives where T.H. Huxley's papers are held. And the only other person in the archive for the several weeks I was there was an elderly woman who we eventually had lunch, and she said, "I'm Angela Darwin," and she's in fact the great-granddaughter of T.H. Huxley, and married the great-grandson of Charles Darwin in an extraordinary match. I mean, really. But, and so it was my great good fortune to happen to be there. You should always speak to the other people in the archives. But she did say that she's obviously extremely interested in the Huxley family, historically extremely learned about the Huxley family, of course, as you would expect. But she did tell me that it's difficult to kind of press back genealogically through Huxley's father's line. And that's partly because T.H. Huxley himself showed very little interest in doing so. I like to think that T.H. Huxley's interest in the past was in the pedigree of Homo sapiens, not the Huxleys. Looking forward in time, however, he did consider himself to be patriarch of a new dynasty. In the end, actually, he installed himself as patriarch of a new science, weightily confirmed by this wonderful Ford classically inspired statue in Kensington from 1900. There sits T.H. Huxley, open, aggressive, clench-fisted, still ready for the fight. Charles Darwin, by contrast, sits cross-legged, closed, speculative. There's no fight in him at all. Chronically sick, Darwin also suffered, but Huxley passed on his demons, his gene recessively appearing here and there in the dynasty that followed. His son Leonard Huxley, here at the back, obliged his father's patriarchal dynastic ambitions. He laboured over T.H.'s papers and made a writing and publishing career out of the extraordinary lives of his father's generation, of the previous generation. Yet occasionally Leonard Huxley published his own thoughts. One such was the book Progress and the Unfit, 1926, in which he wondered at the lack of selection of human raw material for future population. Of the three generations, Thomas, Leonard, Julian, Leonard was the least afflicted by mental illness, insofar as we can tell from the records, and at the same time he was surely the purest eugenicist. His statements Leonard's statements, epitomise British eugenics of the 1920s as second-generation Darwins, Galtons and Huxleys famously pursued restrictions on the reproduction of the mentally unfit. And we should note, incidentally, that they largely failed, legislatively speaking. Leonard Huxley's eugenics was far cruder than anything his son pursued that I discussed last night. He said, for example, Leonard, quote, "The increase of the feeble-minded is like a fungoid growth on a sound tree, precursor of degradation and decay." Well, Leonard's son, Julian, followed his father in sustaining a dynastic vision of the Huxleys. As we've seen, he was immensely proud of the Huxley name, and with every good reason. Julian himself had two sons with Juliet Huxley. In doing so, Julian contravened his own eugenic insistence that those with hereditary defects should not reproduce. And he argued this consistently and over completely different eras within the 20th century. So if we look at his two Galton lectures, for example, delivered in 1936 and again in 1962, this message is equally clear in both. But equally consistently, Julian Huxley was very firm that compulsion to that end was undesirable, even unacceptable. But still, he was very much inclined towards the strong encouragement of eugenic fertility control. Since I did include this image, here is young Julian on the ground, and this is in fact his mother's, Leonard at the back, and his mother's family, really his more favoured family, which are including Mrs. Humphrey Ward, Mary Augustus Ward, and the Arnolds. So that line is a line that he was very happy to sit with and work from, rather than the line through the fathers. Well, to link Julian Huxley's breeding to his eugenic interest in control of human reproduction is not to undertake any kind of crude expose, and insofar as I have a career in the history of eugenics, the first thing that I'm likely to say to any audience is that the tradition that's alive and well of deploying eugenics in a kind of in an expose model drives me to great irritation. If anything, my career as a historian of eugenics is actually about de-exceptionalizing eugenics. And so to bring that into the Huxley story is not to indulge that kind of very easy, if sometimes tempting, expose analysis of eugenics. It is rather to open the rich domain of family history, which in the Huxley context, personally and intellectually, linked genealogy and genes very directly. Over their lifespans, and more importantly, in their own actual work, genealogy was given literally a gene logic. I said yesterday in the lecture that the study of evolution shifts from the material of bones to the materials of genes between these two Huxleys, and it's become in our own time genetic genealogy. Well, genealogy powerfully crosses, of course, family, genetics, inheritance, and powerful subjectivity. It's about origins as well as degrees of connection and difference, shared descent, defining and differentiating individuals and groups. And there's a very fine, rich anthropology of kinship and genealogy that's increasingly emerging, not least with Marilyn Strathern's work. As a way of knowing, genealogy crosses human and natural sciences via anthropology and genetics, and in the Huxley's time firmly grafted kinship and evolution with eugenics. There's no doubt about it. And all of these connections and the kind of rich possibility of thinking about genealogy and family history and genetics is visible in the tree metaphor, the tree diagram that we're all familiar with, that serve to represent inheritance on many different scales. For Darwin, of course, the phylogenetic tree of life was his earliest scribbled imagining of evolution. The delicate design of differentiation, of speciation over time, has endured, quite remarkably, is there an archive scribble that is so recognisable? I'm not sure. It's endured over time as a symbol, actually probably more like a brand. The evolution shirt, this is sometimes sells online as the atheist shirt. The tree image became indispensable to the social evolutionary business of first and second generation Darwinists, the family tree and the tree of man conflating in multiple versions, beautifully so, of course, in Haeckel's Pedigree of Man, for example. And Peter Bowler has written very extensively and with typically great insight into this idea of progress and idea of multiple ideas of connection. Family trees stored and presented data that folded the physical and the bodily together, signalled in the term inheritance. What do we inherit? What inheres in us? Generations of Huxleys explored these questions scientifically, and surely we know, because of their writing, they agonised over them personally. Well, the whole point of eugenics, of course, was to know populations in terms of intergenerational relations, in terms of inheritance, and the tree quickly became the graphic device of choice for the retrieval and visualization of eugenic data and for eugenic pedagogy. Two versions of the eugenic family tree began to circulate very famously. This is entirely recognizable to many, probably most of you, the Galton-Darwin-Wedgwood genealogy. I mean, really an extraordinary, if we think about in a history of design, it's very interesting, I think. Represented eugenic ambitions, eugenic in a really hopeful and optimistic moment, self-intrigued by genius and another version, ability. Perhaps the most recognisable eugenic tree is its own. The eugenic tree of knowledge, a very famous, again in design terms and even art history terms, an extraordinary, really well-known image, but I keep going back to this as someone who is, like so many of us, is both historiographically inclined and really interested in the history of disciplines. This continually intrigues me, this image, this eugenic tree of its own. This kind of tree from the early 20th century, 1921 I think it is comprehensible, was comprehensible only because of all the prior versions of family trees across familial, natural history, scriptural and folk domains. We can read the Huxley generations back into this intellectual and epistemological family tree, the emergence of disciplines out of a polymath 19th century, and back into a human natural science eugenics, which over time, after this period, was to become sociobiology. Natural history and human history were always the same family. So this image was created in 1921 for the International Eugenics Congress, but indulge me for a bit of a hypothetical. I like to imagine it having been drawn by the Huxley family themselves, a representation of their own minds, their own expertise, their own objects of inquiry. On the left, your left, from Thomas Henry, we might have the biocluster, anatomy and physiology, his original training. Anthropometry there as well. We see geo and homo, geology and history coming together as anthropology, which is interesting. Julian's population genetics is there, genetics and statistics. And for and from both of them, sociology comes out of religion and out of education, interestingly and importantly. The Huxley family is represented personally in the roots of genealogy, biography, and psychiatry. Well, the implications of understanding minds and souls, sensibilities as well, as part of evolution, were profound, as many historians have shown. Already in the 1850s, Darwin had perceived the significance of evolution for psychology. He wrote, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researchers. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation." T.H. Huxley barreled typically into the evolutionary psychology space. He connected natural selection explicitly to morality. Quote, "The moral faculty was capable of evolution by natural selection." That's from a lecture to working men in 1862. He and Herbert Spencer, of course, thrived on the idea. Evolutionary psychology was emerging as a new and exciting field. Over time, this all became agnostic, because sceptical, and later perhaps atheistic evolutionary humanism, what Julian Huxley later put as religion without revelation. Well, in his 1927 book of that title, Religion Without Revelation, Julian Huxley presented his family history in a very long and extremely detailed and very kind of disclosing chapter that he interestingly titled Personalia. And in it he revealed that as a young man a kind of torture came with what he called passionate fervours over belief. What he said some called faith. what to believe was unresolvable and created an internal conflict that he himself described in this 1927 book as profoundly miserable. Quote, "Paralyzing my energies by threatening to tear my mental being in half." And he reached for Sigmund Freud. He said, "Freud tells us that a father complex acquired in infancy is the chief or sole reason for our personification of the forces of nature as a personal God." In this book, in this chapter, Personalia, Huxley declared himself to be quite free from a father complex. But he did introduce grandfather as more culpable, unsurprisingly so. The family intellectual tradition, or more accurately expectation, may have produced, he said, what psychotherapists call an inferiority complex, he explained to his readers. This led to painful oscillations, he said, self-describing, between self-distrust and self-assurance, despair and elation, so familiar to many growing minds. Well, in his scientific work, Julian Huxley was able to scale out from his 3-generation genealogy of Huxley minds to evolutionary psychology and the multiple generations of change required. The year he wrote Religion Without Revelation, he was also working with, or probably more accurately under, another forceful father figure, larger than life, H.G. Wells, overbearing. Wells, as I've discussed, persuaded Julian to abandon his professorship at KCL to write The Science of Life. And it's very interesting to go back to Science of Life, which I've kind of mined for several projects, and it's if only many people here have, but I wish that I could write a book that many generations people are going back to and then finding more and more. And I find this almost with every project that I pursue. There's something in The Science of Life yet again. I mean, it's a real incredible credit to Huxley and the Huxley son. Huxley and the Wells father and son. And so for this project, I went back, for these lectures, went back again to The Science of Life. And there is evolutionary psychology. Book 8, they wrote, is a sequence of chapters on behaviour, feeling and thought. Psychology thus entered the Book of Life, their Book of Life, alongside zoology, appropriately conflated and refined via Julian's animal behaviourism, his ethology. Behaviour was not just a human attribute. Insects and other invertebrates behaved in certain ways. Vertebrate behaviour evolved, including into various kinds of consciousness. This is all explained in their Book 8, Behaviour, Feeling and Thought. As far as humans were concerned, the book included sections on the up-to-date, up-to-the-minute behaviourism and on theories and theorists of mind, including Jung. Slightly later in his career, Julian Huxley translated his early study of embryological development into a kind of developmental psychology, tracking from what he called the zero of the human ovum. Definitely no soul there. He said the Freudians call the ovum the primitive superego. He called it the proto-ethical mechanism. In his 1943 lecture, Evolutionary Ethics, in a way this lecture is utterly representative of its moment. One half of the lecture is a meditation on derailed Nazi ethics, 1943. The other half is on developmental psychology and psychoanalysis. He was reading Waddington and especially Melanie Klein at the time. Julian pinpointed after Klein that the second year of human life from this zero of the ovum brought critical individuation of the human self from the mother, or he wrote, the mother substitute. Mother is chief object of love and is chief source of power, the primal conflict that generated, he said, infantile anger, hate, and destructive wishes. So he's fully immersed in a kind of a high moment of Kleinian psychoanalysis. And he saw this actually as an adaptation. So he brings his evolutionary theory, unsurprisingly, to this. It's an adaptation. It's part of a peculiar condition of human infancy. He wrote, out of this primal conflict, there grows the beginning of ethics. Thereafter comes individual ethics, a social ethics, and an evolutionary ethics. Momentarily for Julian Huxley, just take that image in. This is a T.H. Huxley sketch. Momentarily for Julian Huxley, the very simple and simplistic grandfather-induced inferiority complex became something far more sophisticated, focused on the key mother, for better or worse. As arbiter and creator of productive guilt, the mother fully replaced the cultural guilt that used to be produced by God the Father out of original sin. And here I include this T.H. Huxley, it's a very characteristic T.H. Huxley sketch. The grandfather's light rendition of his own mother's power, a 57th birthday ditty, had turned by Julian Huxley's time via psychoanalysis into something far more terrible, surely, for both mothers and infants. Julian Huxley's account was a full and complete mid-20th century secularization of origin and development through evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology. Well, the Huxley intellectual adventures with minds, behaviours and evolution continued right up to Julian's death in 1975. And he shared the adventure with his famous brother, remarkable brother, Aldous. The Huxley grandsons both explored modes of perception in a particularly interesting epoch in the history of psychology and psychiatry. Aldous and Julian's lives spanned the heights of Freudian and post-Freudian psychoanalysis and a period in which psycho-pharmacology was both extensive and largely unregulated. Happily so for Aldous. It was Julian, not Aldous, who suffered, occasionally in psychiatric institutional care, but it was Aldous who introduced Julian to another world of experimental psychiatry. The Lsd Clinical Experiments over the late 1940s and 1950s were led by Aldous's close friend and Julian Huxley's co-author, Humphrey Osmond. Osmond experimented with LSD for the treatment of schizophrenia and for chronic alcoholism. The whole field of LSD use and research was less illicit and regulated that you might imagine. In a way, it was less illicit than intriguing in that particular moment. And in fact, it could be positively reputable. Osmond, for instance, administered LSD to English politician Christopher Mayhew, whose experience was filmed and broadcast by the BBC, who'll be busy today doing something quite different. In 1953, Osmond visited Aldous Huxley's LA home, famously administered a dose of LSD and monitored Aldous Huxley's reaction and experiences. For Huxley, this led to the book, The Doors of Perception. Humphrey Osmond proposed the term psychedelic at a meeting of the New York Academy of Sciences in 1956. He said the word meant mind manifesting. Aldous Huxley's mind manifested until his very last breath and into an afterlife when his psychoanalyst second wife injected him with intramuscular LSD on Aldous's written request. And really interestingly, in her memoir of her life with Aldous Huxley, she called this a sacrament. Well, two kinds of organs and their linked processes recur in Aldous Huxley's opus. And I think when I expand these, there's actually more of even a conventional history of medicine running through all of this, because this is a bit by the by. But I think what is interesting about the Huxleys is this like shadow clinical work. So T.H. Huxley was trained as a doctor, had his apprenticeship, and then he kind of left all that behind. But there's the other interesting thing of many about Aldous Huxley is that he wanted to be a doctor and failed in that ambition because of his eyesight, his near blindness. And at one point, Julian Huxley wrote of Aldous. I may be wrong actually, but I think it was his obituary. That in a way Aldous was spared the banality of being a medical doctor by his own sight, and that launched Aldous Huxley much more expansively into the world. And in a way, T.H. said he was saved from the fate of being a doctor. But I am interested that two kinds of organs, bodily organs, and their linked processes recur in Aldous Huxley's opus, the eye and the brain, sight and mind. These were deeply connected in the author's favoured metaphors of sight and insight, eyes and eyelessness. For close to blind Aldous, seeing was an art as well as a function, linked to consciousness, to perception and to memory. Eyes and the mind were close. And so Aldous's book on therapies to improve sight, The Art of Seeing, morphed into a study of psychotherapy and the pursuit of insight. Doors of Perception and the Art of Seeing were from Aldous's mind and hand, but for the Huxleys intergenerationally, the challenge of mental health and ill health, the links between evolution and sensation, and the mysteries of mind and body produced a long set of inquiries of multiple states of consciousness between life, death, and even the beyond. Let's go back to T.H. for a moment. For T.H., as we've seen, animal consciousness and sensation was a philosophical as well as a physiological question. For humans, cognizance and sensibility operated on a continuum that he early tried to organise and understand, as we've seen. T.H. Huxley witnessed a range of really almost the entire spectrum of Victorian interventions into human consciousness, not least as a medical apprentice, ways of minimising human pain by calibrating and intervening in levels of consciousness was very much part of mid-19th century experimental therapy. One of T.H.'s apprenticeships had been with prominent mesmerist Thomas Chandler, and T.H.'s suffering daughter, Marion, was later treated through hypnosis by Charcot. Hypnosis and mesmerism were early forms of analgesia as well as anaesthesia, indicated in the title of one book from 1861, Pain of Body and Mind Relieved by Mesmerism, a record of mesmeric facts. Well, the phenomena of hypnosis, unconsciousness and anaesthesia were all adjacent to loss of consciousness, even loss of life. Thomas Henry had observed with great interest a very early experimental application of ether as an anaesthetic in Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania in the 1840s. Chloroform was discussed by him in great detail at the Royal Commission on Vivisection. He suggested that it had chloroform itself had very different effects, he said, upon different people. He said occasionally some people were completely stupefied, he said, and would lie like logs. Other people would be subject to the most violent movements, quote, as if of pain, occasionally with groans and screams, and yet insensible to pain. In Sydney, his wife, Henrietta Heathorn, his future wife, Henrietta Heathorn, and she was someone with whom Thomas Henry Huxley was sick in love, there's no other way of putting it, underwent chloroform anaesthetic with very bad results. She herself called it a near death. The family was also sometimes paralysed with grief from death that manifested as a kind of unconsciousness and actually as unconsciousness. So on the sudden death of their Christmas-born son, Noel, Huxley's wife, Henrietta, Nettie, went, she said, out of her mind, She said, unconsciousness often overcame me 4 months after he died. And T.H. Huxley recounted his earliest episode of paralysing depression as triggered by a sudden encounter with lifelessness as a medical student face to face with a human corpse. There was then the closest of connections between mesmerism, hypnosis, anaesthesia and death, and the beyond, since mesmerism was also a means of clairvoyance. And it's one of the really peculiar characteristics of the Huxleys that they were, on the one hand, naturalists and materialists, agnostics, seeking to divorce matter, nature and fact from religion, faith and belief. Yet they were persistently open, and in a way that's care of their agnosticism in some ways, open to possible beyonds, to alternative ways of being, to parallel states of being. Julian Huxley ended his book with H.G. Wells on what they called borderland science, on psychical research. That's the end of the science of life, on mediums and on spirits. What we know beyond life, they imaginatively put in this ecology textbook. Julian Huxley joined the Society for Psychical Research in 1928. He said there was much talk, he's remembering, there was much talk then about curious phenomena such as ectoplasm, telepathy, communication with the dead, extrasensory perception, levitation and so forth. And he's writing that towards the end of his life in his memoirs, remembering the 1920s. And while he might have experienced all of that as characteristic of the late 1920s, in truth, it was probably far more characteristic of his grandfather's later life, the 1880s, 1890s. T.H. Huxley was drawn into late 19th century spiritualism, sometimes indicating an open mind, perhaps disingenuously. Sometimes he said he intended to participate experimentally and adjudicate observationally. T.H.'s agnosticism helped and hindered. It left him open to possibilities again, but closed if there was no way of knowing. And that was the point, of course, about the various seances, that there was no way of knowing. In the 1860s, he wrote to Charles Kingsley, he said, "I'm quite ready to admit that there may be some place other side of nowhere." It's a good title for a book. I'm quite ready to admit that there may be some place other side of nowhere. For example, where 2 + 2 = 5, and all bodies naturally repel one another instead of gravitating together. But he needed this to be provable. This is what he's saying to, unsurprisingly, to Charles Kingsley. He needed this to be provable. What he could prove was fraudulence, and he delighted in doing so. As a much older man, he engaged in a more interesting and interested manner, however. He was known to be agnostic, of course. In fact, he was known to be agnostic doubter general. Yet for some, that meant a genuine open-mindedness. And for this reason, I think, strangers wrote to Huxley, not infrequently. So through his papers are these scattered strange letters about spiritualism, a suite of letters detailing, to T.H. Huxley of all people, ghostly visits and asking for his assessment of the evidence. Medical doctor Elizabeth Blackwell wrote to him in July 1892. Her interest was in ongoing communication across death and the existence of consciousness after this life, she wrote to him. And she was seeking T.H. Huxley's assessment of an experiment she'd designed with a number of elderly friends, all of whom were facing death. And she took great pains in a series of letters to explain to Thomas Henry Huxley that this group was sensible, well-educated, and inquiring. The group likely included her sister, Anna Blackwell, who was a well-known spiritualist. Elizabeth Blackwell wrote to T.H. Huxley that Huxley always sought truth, and she asked him to respond to her request and to the matter as a whole, in that matter and in that spirit, so to speak, as a seeker of truth. His reputation as an experimentalist recommended him, she flattered. And it worked. Blackwell was seeking an adjudication, actually, of her methodology. She appealed to his reputation as open-minded truth seeker and to his well-known active skepticism that underwrote his agnosticism. So actually, as a woman of science, Blackwell was trying to prove in these experiments that she elaborately set up with her friends about whether or not there may be communication over death. And it was quite an elaborate program where an agreement that the first person who died would make a certain number of marks, say certain things, record a number of numbers in a certain place, and the remaining group would be able to verify that. But they would be able to find that. But what Elizabeth Blackwell was looking for was an external verification of this as an experiment, and external verification of these marks of communication between the dead and the living. So she was trying to prove what T.H. Huxley thought was neither falsifiable, nor unfalsifiable. Her appeal to Huxley worked, and Huxley actually responded with some interest and actually with some propositions methodologically for how the experiment might be improved. As it turned out, and this is a series of letters, 1892, Huxley died 1895. As it turned out, Blackwell did not die until 1910, 15 years after Huxley. But for T.H., actually it was an engagement in possible thought worlds, more consistent than inconsistent, even perhaps especially for 19th century's most famous agnostic. And although, as successive biographers and scholars of T.H. Huxley often rightly write about, there's a very famous 1870s episode where Huxley and one of the Darwin, Peter, you'll know which Darwin, or Philippa, one of the Darwin grandsons were writing to one another about one of the Wedgwoods in the wider Darwin family had been, Philippa, it's the 1870s, isn't it, had been essentially conned by this well-known spiritualist. And the Darwin grandson came to Huxley and said, we've got to do something about this, we've got to expose this. And so they set up a very elaborate trap, essentially, for that spiritualist and exposed him very publicly and in a very well-known way. And Adrian Desmond says very interestingly, vis-a-vis some of our conversation, that one of the reasons Huxley could have exposed any number of spiritualists and was quite keen to do so, but many spiritualists were women. And that Desmond, I think, rightly suggests that Huxley was, disinclined to go in for the kill when the victim was a woman. But the Darwin family, via this Wedgwood who'd been taken in, was actually a much more reasonable set of victims. And with that opportunity, they set up a very elaborate seance, actually, to expose the fraud. And Huxley delighted in the series of articles that he went on to write. And the reason I say that is that successive biographers, and certainly Adrian Desmond, put forward that Huxley's exposés of spiritualism as evidence of his agnosticism, and in some ways wrapped up around the story of Huxley's battles with various kinds of religion, I suppose. And in a way, I'd always known that, or for a long time I'd known that about T.H. Huxley, and it's why when I was recently looking at the papers and saw this really interesting, elaborate, multiple set of letters with Elizabeth Blackwell, that Huxley is a much older man, 1890, is facing death himself. In fact, was engaging with Elizabeth Blackwell. Certainly doesn't dismiss, bothers to write back, makes a few suggestions about how the experiment might be better executed, And Elizabeth Blackwell ends up saying, I still have to chase the other side of this correspondence. I'm sure it's there in Blackwell papers. But Elizabeth Blackwell writes a letter thanking him for being so open, for making the suggestions, and then says, be sure to, if I die first, she writes, be sure to write down the exact time of my death. We will need that for the experiment to be proven. So there's evidence there that actually at the end of his life, T.H. Huxley, it's hard to analyse yet, and I'll be chasing the other side of that interesting moment of correspondence. But I labour that point in some ways to suggest this really remarkable continuum of interest that the Huxleys had in all kinds of states of consciousness, states of mind, modes of being, even into the afterlife, which is perhaps the last thing we may expect from this family of agnostics. T.H. Huxley, high Victorian, was fully engaged with explorations of the self, of character, of sensation, as we've seen, and in this lecture, as I've discussed, even of souls and afterlives. He was characteristically high Victorian in all of those ways, yet he hardly displayed that other Victorian characteristic, studied selflessness. His home was filled with portraits of himself, not just in oil, but rather remarkably here in marble. He greeted himself every time he ascended the stairs. The subjectivity of this patriarch of one idiosyncratic family was also thoroughly tied to the family of man and to his invention, this term, the man family. In so many portraits, T.H. Huxley held and claimed the skull of every man, like a sovereign holding an orb, the representative of God's dominion on earth, transformed into a trustee of evolution. Far more modest, surely we like him more, Julian Huxley. We're more likely to see holding an interesting animal, David Attenborough-like, rather than a human skull. Life more than death, animals more than humans, genes not bones were his domain. And yet for both of these men of science and men of modernity, human history and natural history were always of a piece. Well, let me return just with some concluding thoughts to these 4 lectures to the beginning, where I introduced in the Cosmos lecture this question of the age in which I'm thinking expansively about the Huxleys, this so-called Anthropocene that we live in. And I suggested at the beginning that were both of these Huxleys alive, they would be up front and centre in that debate. It's absolutely their kind of human, planetary, cosmological, future-oriented, past-oriented domain. Historians engaged with the Anthropocene often point to an apparently novel convergence of history and biology. Our colleague, many of our friends, the great Dipesh Chakrabarty, signals the collapse, he said, of the age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history. Julia Thomas, leading recently an American Historical Review roundtable, suggests the Anthropocene has produced what she writes as a naturalized history, a cultured nature, and an embodied mind. The Anthropocene has produced that. Well, it's true. Importantly, I've omitted the fact that, in fact, I disagree with both of them. So, one thing that Chakrabarty, Dipesh Chakrabarty's article, 4 Theses, The Climate of History, where he says the age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history has been collapsed by the Anthropocene, is a statement that I've never understood, I have to say, and more strongly completely disagree with. Because as we've seen, natural history, I think it's far more profitable to think of natural history and human history as, in a way, not just linked, but connected and conflated by the 19th and 20th century's greatest humanists. Far from them being distinct, they, in fact, this tradition of humanism always saw natural history and human history together. And of course, with regard to Julia Thomas's otherwise excellent collection there, that the Anthropocene has produced a naturalized history, a cultured nature, an embodied mind, starts to be a kind of in some ways a desperate search for novelty that doesn't actually help us as historians at all. It's true, though, that world historians are putting human history stories into long histories of life and of Earth, even of the cosmos. So David Christian, my friend and colleague, has done so very influentially in his field, Big History, and most recently, just out, his book Origin Story, which folds together, again, cosmology and human history. At the same time, biologists are interested in integrating human history into a scientific story. To pick one example, Ian Morris, or the author of Why the West Rules, the patterns of history and what they reveal about the future, and, more pertinently for us here, his book The Measure of Civilization, argue that history, he says, is a subset of biology, is a subset of chemistry, is a subset of physics. Needless to say, attention to the Huxleys suggests a long-term, not a novel, folding of human and natural histories. Far from a humanist distinction, as I said, these quintessential humanists of the 19th and 20th centuries actually evolved from a natural history that always included humans and a human history that was always natural. And when the American Historical Review Roundtable cites E.O. Wilson's book Consilience, 1998, The Unity of Knowledge, as an Anthropocene-induced novelty, we can see this as both inaccurate and at the very least insufficient. The point is that ageing E.O. Wilson, the great sociobiologist, carries forward a sociobiology, a scale, and an ambition to connect and unite that was a default mode of thinking in the age of modern synthesis. It was even more so in the century before Julian Huxley's own synthesis, the modern synthesis, in the linked natural history and human history that T.H. Huxley's generation added to the even earlier universal history. In 2010, David Christian, my concluding points, projected that universal history would be on the rise in the near historiographical future because he imagines it to have disappeared. But I disagree entirely, especially if we focus our attention on 19th and 20th century polymaths, ecologists and sociobiologists like the Huxleys. We may not agree with their conclusions, we probably don't, or even their models, but if we include studies like the science of life in our historiographical assessment, it's clear that universal history is far more appropriately regarded as an enduring genre, perhaps the most enduring historiographical genre than a returning one. Writing a history of the species, then, is hardly a new endeavour. What endures with universal history is the concept of civilization. And this is what archaeologist Ian Morris deploys in The Measure of Civilization, for example, that book. And it's also what the Huxleys brought forward and authorised. The tradition of critique of civilization has focused on T.H. Huxley's imperial 19th century. Perhaps more important, however, is the use of civilization and its conflation of biology and human history that Julian's generation pursued, because he did so under the aegis of pacifist internationalism, within a discourse of species that was aware of the damage and misuse of biological race, as I've discussed, for a project of global equality of opportunity, and with an acute and expert knowledge of human impact on non-human bio and geo worlds. The history of civilization, wrote Julian Huxley, details the steps by which men have succeeded in building up an artificial world within the cosmos. In every family, in every polity that has been established, the cosmic process in man has been restrained and otherwise modified by law and custom. As civilization has advanced, so the extent of this interference has increased. And in fact, this is much more like our own deployment of Anthropocene, with its urgency, but also its dangers and risks of collapsing parts into wholes. Well, Julian Huxley stored, synthesised and politicised the core knowledge that his grandfather and his grandfather's generation had poured forth. 1 century after Man's Place in Nature, 1863, Julian Huxley considered the future of man, evolutionary aspects, 1963. He diagnosed humankind's present state. He said, in general, man's exploration and control of external nature has far outrun his exploration and control of his own nature. Imperial T.H. Huxley looked backwards in time, inventing the deep human history with which modern historians now are so suddenly engaged. Internationalist Julian looked forward in time, gauging the future from a high modern mix of catastrophe and optimism. He invented the word transhumanism, the prospect that humankind might move and change even beyond itself. He says, the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another, but in its entirety as humanity. We need a name for this new belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve, man remaining man, but transcending himself by realising new possibilities of and for his human nature. These 19th and 20th century trustees of evolution, 1825 to 1975, not only show us but also actively gave us models to pursue and models to avoid, for thinking humanity and nature together, for folding humankind, homo, into bio and geo and cosmo worlds. Models to pursue and models to avoid, for placing the species into deep pasts and distant futures. Thank you very much indeed.